Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is a notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front on Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
I'm Michael. I'm a senior intel analyst at Artorias.
Hey, I'm Mike. I'm an analyst as well at Artorias.
And in this episode, we're going to actually discuss about two key topics that we saw happening within the last week. Now, as you recall, we did do a breaking podcast episode where unfortunately Matt cannot have joined us that talked about the situation in Venezuela and the U.S. Special Operation mission that captured Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. And to be honest, a lot of us thought that that was going to be the major geopolitical story, not only of January, but of 2026 as a whole. But as time has it, that appears to be a lie. And 2026 appears to be another year of intense geopolitical and military conflicts that are going to spread across the world. Just as the military operation was in Venezuela ended and reactions were pouring in, we started to see protests in Iran escalate. So now, after almost 2 weeks of protests across Iran against the Islamic Republic, taking favor pitch with reports of at least 500 protesters being killed and estimates wide range of up to 2,000, if not 10,000 protesters were killed by the Islamic Republic trying to clamp down. And that has now brought the attention of President Trump, who's now threatening to do military operations against Iran. As of this recording, January 12th, President Trump has been briefed on a multitude of options to include cyber and psychological operations to target the Islamic Republic. And that is where we are right now in the start of January 2026. So these are the topics we want to talk about: Venezuela and Iran. And so first, let's talk about Venezuela and the aftermath of the operation that led to the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his indictment into the Southern District of New York. What have we seen since then? Well, now we see that President Trump has, in a way, accepted the remnants of the Maduro and Chavista regime. In other words, what we saw was a leadership change in Venezuela, not a regime change. And now the vice president of Venezuela is acting president, and her name is Delcy Rodriguez. And we talked about this in the previous episode of The Bluff. And it looks like Diosdado Cabello and the Minister of Justice, Peace and Interior, and the Minister of Defense, Vladimiro Padrino Lopez, have coalesced around Delcy Rodriguez, although there's are rumors that Diosdado Cabello specifically might be wanting to launch a coup, and maybe his loyalty to Delcy Rodriguez and this imposition of basically American rule over Venezuela is not something he's willing to tolerate along the long term. But with that, we'll go to our speakers to talk about Venezuela before we pivot to Iran. And with that, Matthew, you weren't here in the previous episode that we had with Christian and Michael to kind of talk about Venezuela. So I want to give you the opportunity in this episode to at least get what is your immediate reaction and what did you think about when you saw U.S. forces capture Nicolas Maduro? What do you think the broad geopolitical implications are? Because one of the things I think is for certain from a military perspective, this was a hugely successful operation.
So I'll say my first reaction was I think that they were going to be framing this as, continuing this framing around it being a anti-drug operation. I think that's a little bit ironic with the recent pardoning that we've seen of others within government that were also tied to the trafficking of drugs. But my second response was that I was impressed that a lot of the things that maybe I've worried about a little bit with the intelligence community and with the government are still the best of the best. That's a pretty seamless operation, not to have lost anyone. And then I thought the choice to sort of leave the core regime networks in place, it's not what I was expecting. And I think it undermines a lot of the traditional sort of comments that have been made around Venezuela and sort of the framework that has been put forward traditionally as to why the United States might intervene. And I know we've talked about this in the past, and by creating this narrative of narco-terrorism, he was already moving away from that framework. But it is surprising that the security services and a lot of those core regime networks were still in place because to some extent, I think that undermines the argument that the whole of the government was part of this cartel of the Suns. Um, it also means that they're going to be relying on sort of like the paramilitary and the pro-regime groups to maintain stability. That could prove difficult. That, it could be a spoiler if there's any sort of issue in terms of funding. But at the same time, it would be, I think, a lot more chaos if those structures weren't maintained. So at the end of the day, I personally I disagree with it. I don't think this was a smart move. I think we're going to see and have seen a lot of backlash from the international community, but um, the actual arrest itself and the operation around that uh, was still impressive.
I think, that's the interesting aspect, right? And we talked about this in our spaces on X, and now we're holding at least 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So for our listeners, if you want to join us in that, please do. But Michael, I mean, we kind of discussed this in the space about Venezuela, and I mean, it does look like when we're having a conversation about Nicolas Maduro, and one of my immediate reactions after the soft raid that captured the Venezuelan dictator was, is Nicolas Maduro kind of the glue holding everything together? Or is he a piece of the puzzle? And Matt, I mean, you're right that that they only went after Maduro and when the Cartel de los Soles and kind of the Venezuelan military's involvement in drug trafficking is very widespread, but clearly they're okay with the other remnants. And it's important to note, Diosdado Cabello still has the bounty on his head, for example. So for narco terrorism and drug trafficking, but Michael, it looks like the regime is able to survive without Nicolas Maduro. That he wasn't the glue holding everybody together, but he was a piece of the pie, and clearly the piece of the puzzle. And the United States is not interested right now in creating regime change and maybe furthering the chaos in Venezuela that might have broader implications, specifically, another refugee crisis into the United States. So I guess the question then is, in the immediate aftermath after our last episode, and we're already over almost 2 weeks since the operation occurred, we haven't really seen much impact. Do you think then, from a geopolitical and regional stability perspective, that Nicolas Maduro wasn't such a key figure, and that maybe President Trump made the right call in capturing him, understanding that he wasn't a key figure within the regime and that the regime can continue without him?
Well, I personally think that honestly, not enough time has passed for us to answer all of those questions. I do think that we are going to see what Maduro's real place in the regime was and what his real place in the whole scheme of it all, especially when it comes to Venezuela's day-to-day operations and how they're going to face uncertainty in the coming months, and especially how they're going to communicate with the United States from here on out. While we right now do see that like most of the day-to-day operations are still operating, and most of those who held power in Venezuela are still holding those positions of power, it kind of does fall into what the Trump administration is going to want to do next. While things are calm, as we could say right now, and not much has really changed besides Maduro leaving, that could change it almost at any minute, depending on who or what wants to establish power within Venezuela. And if we want to see any big changes, I personally believe that the Trump administration would definitely want to keep things at the status quo, and they probably expected that just removing Maduro was going to keep things the way that they are for the long term, then probably just seeing some small changes in the short term to maintain whatever they'd like to maintain. And I would hope that there was more to it, but as President Trump had said himself, that they're in Venezuela mainly for the oil. So as long as we see that oil resources and more investment into that from the United States, then we're probably not going to see much changes at all, and we're probably going to see, whoever comes and fills the void from here on out just fall into the same position of what Maduro was doing, albeit with now more cooperation with the United States.
Mike, actually, let me ask a kind of a very similar question to you, but if it's from a different perspective, a different take. Because today, again, January 12th, we also got reporting from CBS that regardless of the rhetoric from the Trump administration, they're actually not interested in regime change in Cuba. And although President Trump has said, Venezuelan oils are not going to go to Cuba, and that Cuba, should come up to a deal, that right now the Trump administration is not trying to forcefully cause regime change, nor do they want an economic collapse in Cuba that instigates regime change, but they want negotiations with Cuba, maybe some liberalization within Cuba, within the construct of the, kind of the communist government. And the report kind of backs that up because the United States hasn't really told Mexico to stop sending oil to Cuba. And it looks like Mexico is kind of picking up in a way, not to the same degree, but picking up kind of the way that the oil that Cuba has lost from Venezuela, Mexico is picking it up. So I guess kind of from your perspective, Mike, I mean, you look at what Trump did in Venezuela against Maduro. You were getting this reports from CBS News and how they're approaching it with Cuba, that they don't want to necessarily see a regime collapse, but maybe liberalization or see changes and reform within the regime. Is this a situation where, maybe the Trump administration is using military power and it's, for short-term military objectives, but not really thinking it's going to have long-term regional impact in these regimes? And if that's the case, do you think that this is the right approach, or is it a too risky approach?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, for the regional impact, it's huge, right? Cuba has relied on Venezuela for so long for the oil being the lifeblood, right? To be able to maintain status on the island. And right, Cuba has dire economic situation right now. With, read about it all the time. Even just basic food surplus is just completely decimated on the island. So it's an interesting situation, and it kind of go back to something Michael was saying in terms of how they decided to kind of go about taking apart the Maduro regime, right? We all know, we were reading today that some of the reporting coming out saying that the air defense systems weren't even hooked up, right? So it seems like if the United States wanted to, they could have took out a few more targets in Venezuela and really pushed it. And it seemed like they wanted to kind of maintain status quo in Venezuela, and there may have been a reason for that, right? We talk about regional impact. Well, migration flows is obviously an important thing for the Trump administration right now, and keeping keeping Venezuela stable is extremely important to ensure that migrants aren't coming up through Panama and through Central America into the United States, right? You don't want a civil war that might drive people north. So there's a bit of a balancing act by the Trump administration when it comes to Venezuela, and we see that with Cuba, right? We see some of the rhetoric coming out saying, oh, Cuba wants to make a deal before it's too late. And then we had President Diaz-Canel coming out and saying, no, there's no negotiations with the United States, even though Trump may have alluded to it. So it's interesting just to see these regional dynamics play out now with Venezuela, who played such a pivotal role, kind of being sidelined at the moment with Maduro stepping aside, or being forced to step aside, I should say.
So I think,
go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
So I think one of the problems that they will have in terms of, if we're talking about things like migrant flow, is that this is not going to fix any of the core issues that a lot of the Venezuelans on the street are facing. It has resulted in what's most likely going to be this sort of rebalancing of the regime, but it doesn't fix the issues for the people on the streets. And anytime that we have that rebalancing, there is a threat of chaos being entered into the mix. So like some of the things I think that are worth watching is just the sort of cohesion within those who are left within the regime. Do we potentially have some on the security forces who see the opportunity to go for power? And if we see a fracturing, that's when the situation might become much worse and result in much higher migrant flows.
Now, before we pivot to Iran, though, Matt, let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. It does look like this operation against Maduro, though, we did see shortly. I mean, again, the administration said, okay, Cuba, and then Colombia, and then Mexico, right? I mean, those were the three that they kind of liked. Well, we got the reporting from CBS saying, well, Cuba, we don't want necessarily regime collapse or regime change forcibly, even though, Trump says it publicly, they're trying to figure out other ways to do it. Colombia, the president, even though with all the tensions and even the sanctions that the U.S. have done against Colombian President Petro Gustavo, the Colombian president and the Trump administration had bilateral conversations over the phone, and it looks like this conversation went really well, are going to continue. And now we have Mexico, which is maybe that one country that would kind of say, okay, maybe U.S. unilateral military operations against Mexican cartels is a possibility. But we haven't really seen, outside of just, there was the immediate outrage, but then quickly all the countries kind of dismissed it or weren't really raised that much concern. And so again, I'm just trying to figure out, is this just a new era of American politics that at least in South America we're seeing, and the Western Hemisphere where it's being prioritized? Instead of speak softly and carry a big stick, it's, speak loudly and carry a big stick. And we're not really seeing pushback because China hasn't really done anything. Russia can't do anything. Obviously, Iran can't do anything. The Cubans can't do anything. The Nicaraguans can't do anything. The Brazilians won't do anything. So, I mean, is just forcing your will on South America, it kind of worked with Panama. We're not really seeing pushback, but is there a greater risk that I might be missing, Matt?
So I think it might be one of those situations where this certainly took a lot of the oxygen out of the room. I don't think anyone in those countries wants to put their own regime at risk. I think the larger risk is sort of like we've talked about this before in the Middle East, like the day after the day after. What are the ramifications of this that haven't come to the surface yet? And I think that's kind of, what Michael was saying, where it's too soon to say how this all plays out. I think no one was in a position already to do all that much for Venezuela. And I think the larger issue that we're going to see on the world stage is this a green light for China and their own ambitions and policies, specifically towards things like the South China Sea and Taiwan? And so do they feel more comfortable now than they did in 2025 taking those actions? I think the answer is probably yes.
So if I may, to round out Venezuela, I think from my perspective and how I would analyze this is, I would agree with kind of the statements, Michael, you said that it's too soon to tell. I was asking questions to kind of spur debate. I think we are in a position it's too soon to tell, but I'm very interested in two aspects. One, the opposition. We continue to see the opposition led by Marina Corina Machado and kind of the internationally recognized president Mundo Gonzalez continue to advocate, like, look, Delcy Rodriguez is not a reliable partner. Delcy Rodriguez has been with Chavez for a very, very, very long time. And more importantly, Diosdado Cabello was even longer involved with the Chavista regime in even his time in the military. And that a lot of these, have been very much entrenched in undermining American interests in the Western Hemisphere. It was really these key figures, much more so than probably even Maduro, that really enabled, let's say, the Chinese, the Russian, and more importantly, the Iranians to set a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. It's important to note that a recent terrorist plan hatched by Iran to assassinate the Israeli ambassador in Mexico that was foiled by the Mexican and American law enforcement authorities. The brainchild and the planning operation of that terrorist attack came from the Iranian embassy in Caracas. And Marina Corina Machado really is trying to highlight that. But I think what we saw is the Trump administration just didn't believe in the Venezuelan opposition. They didn't see them having a roadmap to create a transitional government or a stable government. And it almost ran into the situation where the Venezuelan opposition, we had an episode way back talking about this extensively, which one of the failures that we've identified of the Venezuelan opposition is that they never really attempted to really pry away either the military or the state institutions from Chavismo and Maduro. They just fundamentally failed to do that. And it almost became like the opposition's sole focus was to win an election as if that's the end goal and that's the end of the journey, rather than saying, that's the beginning of the journey. And more importantly, how are you going to ensure that the institutions that have been so corrupted and politicized by Chavez and Maduro are able to function with you in power? Because the corruption has become an embedded piece of Maduro to ensure that his regime stays in power. And I think the Trump administration looked at the opposition and says, you don't have a plan, you're not giving me a plan, so we're going to go with Delcy Rodriguez. We're going to maintain that aspect with Delcy Rodriguez, and clearly Diosdado Cabello and Vladimiro Padrino Lopez agreed that for now, they have to rely on Delcy Rodriguez. And again, The wild card in this situation, the one person who can really put everything into chaos is Diosdado Cabello. But Emilio Padrino Lopez, although he's the Minister of Defense and has the military, to be honest, if you kind of read him and you analyze him and you study him, he's the person who's just in the right place at the right time, and he just kind of takes a step back and rarely takes the initiative move forward. He'll just go where the winds push him to go. Diosdado Cabello is the brutal, wannabe, dictator who can put Maduro into a conversation of being child's play compared to what we had. And that's the key figure that I would be concerned about. There are understandings that when los colectivos, after Maduro was captured, los colectivos were running amok in Caracas and other parts of Venezuela, with even the U.S. State Department saying that los colectivos, kind of these thugs and armed militias loyal to Chavez, but not necessarily part of the state, were targeting Americans, was because of Diosdado Cabello, much more so than Vladimir Padrino Lopez. And that's the problem, and that's the aspect. And so, the question of Maduro being a piece of the puzzle, the glue holding everything together, I think it's a little bit of both. But the question is, he was the one who's trying to keep everybody content and happy within the institutions that they built. And now that he's gone, Delcy Rodriguez is clearly just a figurehead, and she's only there because of two people, because Vladimir Padrino Lopez and Donald Trump let her be there. And she was just a consensus candidate. So I think time will tell, but there's a lot of areas of insecurity. I'd be interested to see when Marina Corina Machado meets with President Trump later this week, what comes out of it, and if there's a transition plan actually established. And more importantly, does that transition plan include democratic elections inside of Venezuela for 2026? And is that going to be monitored by international observers? And depending on the result of those elections, will those be honored by kind of the Chavista Maduro regime or the remnants of them to ensure that there's a proper transitional government or transition into a democratic, stable Venezuela? I'm a little bit skeptical of that because a lot of the Chavez and Maduro loyalists rely on corruption, drug trafficking, and others to kind of stay in power. And that's something that clearly I don't see Marina Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez enabling to operate freely. But Mike, I saw your hand up, so I'll go to you.
Hey, Stefano. Yeah, thanks. Just one thing I think kind of escaped a lot of the media that was covering this, and right, the story moved so quickly, is that we have to look back to 2019, right? And we hear the name Juan Guaido, and you didn't really hear that all that much, but that was, during the previous Trump administration, right? In 2019, there's the supposed coup that's going to happen, and Juan Guaido appears, and the military is supposed to get behind him and turn, and then Padrino eventually comes on TV and says, "No, I'm a Chivista to the end," and all of that was, I think, kind of led, this story seemed to move so fast and come from nothing. But I think that really was the framework that the Trump administration was coming into this, right? Is realizing they had to be careful with the opposition and understanding really what it was and how organized it was. And right, there are some very strong voices who say the right thing and want to do the right thing, but it's just an extremely difficult security apparatus right now in Venezuela, right? The National Bolivarian Armed Forces, what are they, over 100,000 troops? You have Sabine still active. You have GGCIM still active, right? All the intelligence services. So it's just such a challenging security environment. And the Trump administration had really learned from 2019 that it was just going to be a tricky situation. So to see what they did, it seemed like a very calculated effort to try and make a change.
No, and I would say like the security apparatus. I mean, I think the Venezuelan military is very good to show things that they have on paper, but not necessarily those capabilities exist in reality. I think that's what we saw in the U.S. military operations that led to the capture of Maduro. That specifically the air defense. The Venezuelans had the S-300s from Russia, and they were not properly manned or operated by the time of the operations, and I think goes to that. I mean, one of the interesting aspects that, I remember I had a conversation with a think tank, and we were talking about kind of wargaming this. And my argument was, if there's a scenario where Marina Corina Machado and Mundo Gonzalez is kind of put in power, one of the concerns, and then this was kind of backed up by a New York Times report about kind of how Southcom did war games about analyzing about the fall of the Chavista Maduro regime. What they saw was chaos and violence kind of skyrocket, and I kind of concurred with that because the issue is maybe the opposition has luck in solidifying control in urban centers, like the large urban centers like Caracas, right, and other cities like that. But that's a maybe. And there's going to be a lot of problems with those colectivos specifically who have a very strong presence in urban centers, specifically in poor neighborhoods. But let's say that it's going to be hard, but they get that. The problem is, how do they extend their reach into the border regions and the rural areas of Venezuela that have been such gutted, and there's no government presence and there's no military presence to really speak of. And a lot of those, the governance of those areas have been kind of pushed on to these gangs, terrorist organizations, narcotics and organized crimes like the ELN, the Ejército Liberal Nacional de Colombia, they own the large areas, specifically the Venezuelan-Colombian border. I mean, that is their territory. And it would be very hard to make an argument that you can see Marina Corina Machado take control of, let's say, Apure, Venezuela, which borders Venezuela, borders Colombia. And so that's where the violence and the problem, and then the aspect of the military, the military relied on corruption because inflation and the economic situation was so bad that they only had corruption to kind of move forward and survive. And that's what Maduro says: you can be corrupt, but I demand loyalty in exchange. And if I tell you to do something, you will do it. He built this patronage system all for himself. And if you read the indictments in the Southern District of New York, that is a key phrase that they said even within the drug trafficking aspect of the Venezuelan military. But the key aspect they also put was patronage. And we've seen this in time and time again in countries and regimes of high levels of corruption is they enable corruption, but they get a piece of the pie and they demand loyalty. Well, can we honestly make an argument that every single Venezuelan military who has enriched themselves, specifically the commanders, on corruption, were willing to raise their hand and say, okay, we'll go back to a democratic transition? I just don't think that was a realistic expectation. And I think that's why they went with Delcy Rodriguez. Michael, go ahead.
I absolutely agree with Stefano. I mean, I just have to say straight out, I don't see really a future where the opposition, the formal opposition in Venezuela is going to hold power or really have any influence in government. I don't see that happening. I don't see that being really, quote unquote, allowed by the Trump administration. I think they see that the current, as you said pretty much perfectly, is that how the current setup in Venezuela is that the threat of violence and the threat of any future uh, stability really relies on the current systems that are in place being maintained, and any opposition that wants to take power in Venezuela is going to need a full revamp of how Venezuela is ran and how most of the border, not even the border regions, the rural regions, and just everything in the country works from top to bottom, and that's a very tall order. That's that we haven't seen that really done successfully almost anywhere. I mean, some people can use Syria as an example, but Syria is still very much plagued by internal divisions, ongoing skirmishes, and is not going to see relative peace for a very long time. And if having something like that in Venezuela, right on America's doorstep, I can guarantee that's not something the Trump administration wants. One at the threat of an even larger migrant crisis, or even just the threat of having a destabilized state right in our backyard. So I think the Trump administration knows what they're doing, and they are not a lot of people have asked them the question multiple times how they see the opposition playing a role in Venezuela, and I think they answered truthfully. They don't, and they don't probably have any plans to.
Well, I think that now is a perfect opportunity to move on to our next topic of conversation in the chaos of January 2026, Iran. And I think that's a key component. Are we seeing similarities between the situation in Venezuela and the situation in Iran? I know earlier today we had a very long space on X, formerly on Twitter, where, Michael, Mike, myself, and Trevor, the kind of the intel team of Artorias, we discussed about all the latest in Iran. But let's start with that point, right? I mean, we were discussing about the failures and the inability of the Venezuelan opposition to take charge. I guess the question is, what about Iran? I mean, is this a situation where we might see a successful mass uprising kind of transition into a political control? I mean, is this a scenario like Nepal, where we saw at the end of 2025, where Gen Z, specifically the Gen Z protests, kind of came in and overthrew the government because of the corruption and put somebody else in charge? Is that something that we might look at in Iran? Or do we see the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, try to lead a transitional government? Or is the regime a lot more stable than many realize? And now we have the wild card of another further Trump military action that can change the dynamic on the ground. So, Matthew, I'll go to you. What do you think? I mean, the violence has spread. Thousands of Iranians have died. But the protests today, still tonight, even with internet shut down and the military and the IRGC ground forces there, protesters are still going out of the streets. So, Matthew, what do you think? Is this a scenario where maybe 2026 might be the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic?
Well, I think it's more likely now than it has been anytime in the recent history. I think this protest has more staying power than what we saw back in, I believe it was 2022. Um, But some of the stuff that we were just talking about would still apply here, and I think there's a risk here um, of sort of seeing something similar where you see a restructuring of the regime. I mean, obviously, look at the cohesion again within the security forces. That will give you an idea of the direction this is going. But what sort of mechanism do the people protesting have if the people in something like the IRGC refuse to align with them? I think what you end up with is you're far more likely to see something like a senior leader within the IRGC try and take control. So I guess like, really my question to the rest of the panel is, what does success look like?
Mike, let me go to you first. What does success look like in your eyes?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and challenging question. I mean, from the protesters' perspective right now, right, it'd be nothing short of regime change, right? The stepping aside of the Ayatollah, this, disbanding of the IRGC and a liberalization of Iran. Now, currently, that does not seem to be viable. I mean, Matt, you just kind of brought it up, right? Without the security forces, at least a tacit approval, revolutions don't succeed, right? We've seen that through history, and we could try to pick and choose, but really, it's at least a part of the situation that needs to change in Iran for the protest to be successful. And whether that's 30% of the armed forces or more, right? It just seems to be something that hasn't broken yet. I know we had the Crown Prince come out and said he had some 50,000 defectors and all those stuff. We really just haven't seen that. And that's a key indicator right now to look at, right, as intel. So that's those kind of things we try to keep, our eyes on. And we've seen that the IRGC, the RTS have gone into the streets and been willing to violently suppress their own people. So success right now might look like small changes, right? What about the economic situation? What if that actually gets addressed? Now it's a very challenging thing, and the Iranian president, come out and said, "Hey, I don't think we can do much about it, but maybe there's some opportunities there for it." But it just depends on it's all in the eye of the beholder, right? The crown prince says he's coming back to Iran. Is that success? I don't know. There might be some people who say, actually, I don't want to go to the past. I want to go to the future, right? There's certain populations in Iran who are looking for all their own representation. So what success looks like all depends on who's looking at it and how they might think the future should look for Iran.
Michael, let me ask the same question for you. What does success look like in your opinion?
It might be slightly controversial for me to say, but I think what most protesters and what most people actually might see as success is just simply small changes we see in Iran's system. While these protests are very intense, if you have like very key changes happen in Iran, whether it be an opening up of their economy, better economic possibilities for the people of Iran, slight liberalization of the regime rules, or just simply more promises towards security, you might see a greater acceptance by the people, especially those who are protesting. And I think that that's probably the best success that we'll kind of see out of Iran, is that they're taking these protests and using them to you know, change a couple things across the regime, whether it be, I personally think the economic ones would cause major changes and cause, a lot less, tendency towards violence and a lot more security towards Iran. If it could definitely look more inward towards itself. Again, it's quite possible that there's a lot of different expectations of what a lot of these protesters have. I mean, it's not a unified movement. It's not it's not an organization lashing out. It's various different people angry for various different things. So how success looks to them could be just wildly different across the board. But I think just comfort and, more security for them would probably be enough for, a vast majority of them.
But I think that, the success piece, right, is an important conversation. But I think Matthew, kind of when his reaction, brought up an excellent point. I mean, this does have much more staying power. And again, we have to remember, right, the Islamic Revolution of 1979 that overthrew the Shah lasted over a year. It was a long process, and I think even some of these protests that we've seen, even in the Arab Spring, were a lot longer. And although we can look at the Iranian protests and say they've lasted about 2 weeks, it did start out as an economic grievance perspective and then kind of took a life on its own. And, we talked about this, how last Thursday, and that's kind of when we had the spaces on Twitter to go over the Iran protests, really marked a before and after within that protest. It's almost like you have to analyze that the last Thursday is almost a beginning where the protest almost became an uprising. Right. And I think that's the more apt term. Like, you can't really necessarily analyze what's going on in Iran just from a protester perspective, but much more significant from the tone of not only just the size, but even the ability, the willingness to use sometimes violence and destruct some symbols of the Islamic Republic, right, from banks, military bases, Iranian state media institutions, government institutions. We've really seen a propensity to do that, and the Islamic Republic, the Iranian state media, have acknowledged the death of over 110 members of the Iranian police and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so I think that's kind of what we're in a different time period. We're in this uprising, or even this, you can even call it an insurrection in a sense. And it might have much more staying power. And I think what people need to understand, because a lot of the debate comes back as you look at the videos, like, well, the protests that big or the size, et cetera, et cetera. And I tell this to people, I think what people are missing is not just the perspective of the protesters, but is the Islamic Republic and the regime themselves. Because last Thursday, they marked a before and after. On Thursday, generally events that we kind of see spread out in levels of intensity and reprisal to kind of clamp down protests and the threat perception of the regimes generally last a couple of days or weeks. We all saw happen in basically less than 24 hours. And that was once the shutdown of the internet, always a telltale sign. Almost immediately, we saw the deployment of the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then shortly after, the next day on Friday, we saw the first indications of the deployment of the air attached to the normal Iranian military. And generally, those three things happen kind of spread apart from each other, and they all happen together, indicating that the regime is very, very, very concerned about these protests, and they immediately went to mass violence to achieve their objective and try to clamp this down, right? And I think that's the very interesting aspect of this movement that we're seeing. Now the question then becomes, how does the United States respond? And we had another space that kind of war gamed it. And what does that look like? But I think from the Islamic Republic's perspective and the regime's perspective, they are concerned. And they might be concerned not only necessarily because of the protest ability to kind of overwhelm them, but defections. We've heard that already from state media. They're concerned about defection was a telltale sign of regime instability and collapse. And we've already seen reports of them trying to get asylum either in Russia or even Qatar. So I think the Islamic Republic and Iran as a whole is very concerned about these protests. And the fact now they're willing to directly say we're willing to negotiate about the nuclear deal and our nuclear program. I mean, I think there's a lot of signs there that this is different than 2022, 2019, or even 2009. This is a fundamental before and after. And we could talk the reasons why about it and rehash all that. But from my perspective, the Islamic Republic is extremely, extremely concerned.
Well, I think with that concern that's coming from within, I think there should also be, we should be looking at the moderates and seeing how they react. Is there going to be a survival instinct that shows them maybe aligning with repression of these protests? And I liked the points on what does success look like that you guys were making, because that more or less aligns with my thinking on this. For the protesters, small economic improvements to a large extent, because this is about the economy and not necessarily the broader security forces, would potentially be seen as a win. But to do that, I think they need to find sanctions relief. So I think the nuclear element of this provides a very unique and somewhat scary facet to the situation, but also the proxy network means that whatever happens here is going to have broader effects on the region.
No, and I think that's something where, Michael, you brought up, which kind of says, do we start seeing in Iran being much more inward looking? And I think one of the aspects that was very interesting covering this protest during the weekend and doing the spaces and all the things that we do is that we were tracking specifically, let's say, Israeli media and one of the interesting Israeli assessments from the intelligence agencies in Israel that kind of caught my attention was regardless of how this ends, even if the regime, let's say, survives this later round of protests, the idea of the Islamic Republic is no longer long-term project, right? And how they said it is that the Islamic Republic, the dream of the Islamic Republic is going to end. Maybe not now, but it has an expiration date in the foreseeable future, and that's going to be the marked difference between these protests and other protests. Right before there was staying power within the Islamic Republic, the violence was able to even solidify the control, and in this way, this later protest I think shattered that. And there's a multitude of reasons, right? I mean, the Iranian economy is in shambles. The rial, their currency, is absolutely worthless against the dollar and the euro, fundamentally worthless. The water crisis has ravaged Iran to the point where even the president of Iran said we might need to evacuate the capital. The 12-day war shattered the visibility and this impression of Iranian invisibility and protection. That's no longer feasible. And Israeli military actions before that, after October 7th, had really shattered their proxy project in the Shia Crescent. And so I think the long-term vision of the Islamic Republic, and especially the ideas of this kind of ever-expanding and international Islamic revolution, that is clearly going to end another piece. And so now do we start seeing a much more inward-looking, as Michael said, nationalistic Islamic Republic, or even basically maybe the collapse of the mullahs eventually? But I think the immediate term might be, do we start seeing these proxy organizations and proxy groups, like Hezbollah is not receiving the support they need to continue to kind of function as a long-term project within Lebanon? Do we see that completely collapse because of the economic grievance and the sanctions? And maybe that's the argument. And that's the before and after that's why now in the past, Iran was able to move their way around. And I think now, unfortunately, they're not in a position to really push this forward and continue to operate as things were before this latest round of protests.
Well, I gotta say, I genuinely think that we've kind of seen the collapse of, Iran's attempts at, dominance within the Middle East. I mean, long before these protests. I mean, we saw it in their loss of their ally in Bashar al-Assad, so their loss of influence within Yemen. We've seen it continuously with all of their proxies failing to really achieve a lot of the goals that they, have aimed for. While we can say that their influence is still like palatable, a lot of like this Cold War that existed between Iran and the Gulf states really has shifted in the favor of the Gulf states, and the influence Iran had over the Middle East and had over, a lot of the conflicts in the region has already been diminishing. And I absolutely do believe that these protests, while are not the final nail, are one of the nails in the coffin of, Iran's, full attempts at, exporting the revolution in a sense.
Mike, let me go ask this question to you, Mike, and because we were talking about this, and I think maybe also one of the reasons why we've seen the idea of Iran's ability to project the Islamic Revolution and rely on these proxy networks haven't really degraded, but much more from a military perspective, right? I think we cannot underestimate the death of Qasem Soleimani and how much that really shattered Iranian proxy networks. That only worsened with the after October 7th and these IDF operations, not only in Gaza but Lebanon, and then the 12-day war, and how the 12-day war really targeted a lot of key senior leaders within the IRGC. So, I mean, is this a scenario where maybe military action has been the most clear reasoning why the Iranian proxy network and the Iranian threat network has really suffered, maybe to a point of no return?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, these leadership get systematically picked off one by one. I mean, whether it's the United States, whether it's Israel, I mean, it's just been astounding to watch. And it has to be a very uncomfortable position the second your name gets called to be put in one of those leadership positions in Iran, right? Suddenly that the target's on your back and you could be next at any moment. And all of your underlings could be a Mossad agent, right? And it has to be a very, very difficult, stressful, and just full of paranoia. And talking about the militia groups, and whether it's Shia militia groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, even the Houthis, right? We're looking at a situation here where these groups had kind of looked to Iran to coordinate their actions, and now we're seeing Iran turn inwards, right? And its inability to really export its revolution. Well, what do? Right now, Israel's picking off Hezbollah one by one. We see it every day in reporting. Another leader killed, another strike on infrastructure, right? Hamas has been decimated. The Houthis, right? They still have their hold in Yemen, but could they be next on the target list? So it's really interesting to see how Iran's influence has been tested and how these groups are going to have to react. And just to throw a question out to the group to see, could a collapsing Iran be a dangerous Iran, right? Could as things start to break down, could decisions be made by those who maybe are on the far side of the decision making and encourage some of these groups to maybe carry out attacks that they would have been told to hold off on, in the past?
That's an interesting way. I wouldn't be so much concerned about somehow this idea that Iran is holding the proxy networks back. Because let's look at the most powerful proxy networks they have, Hezbollah. And, there's a ceasefire in place in Lebanon, and Israel and the IDF continue to conduct drone strikes on a daily basis, killing Hezbollah operatives. And Israel is unable to stop. Lebanon is unable to stop it or even respond. Right? That's not necessarily where my concern. I think the concern, not only from the administration but from the region as well, and some of these diplomatic circles, I think is much more of a concern. Do we see a collapse in Iran of the Islamic Republic cause a similar situation what we saw in Libya? And the two areas what I would be looking at is, one, these nationalistic ethnic minority groups that have already had a lot of rebellions, such as the Baluch, the Baluchistan in Pakistan and Iran, specifically the border and the tensions that it has involved in both countries, and the Kurds in northwest Iran, and how that has impacted both Iraq and Turkey, right? And so there's a concern that a collapse in Iran can kind of embolden and empower these two minority groups and others. That could be an area of concern, and it's also this situation of Libya, like just a breakdown of just stability within Iran and how that could spread instability across the region. It's similar to what we saw in Syria, right? And I think that's kind of the issue, and I think that's kind of how the region is looking at it. And there's almost an argument to be made, and we talked about this in the space, that I think we're all in agreement that Iran is in a very weak state, that Iran is in this very weak state. And it's almost a situation where that's maybe how people in the region would rather have it. I think if Iran were to come onto the scene and cut their support from their proxy networks and get into a nuclear agreement and even maybe start opening negotiations about their ballistic missile program, even within the construct of the Islamic Republic, a lot of countries in the region said, okay, we can live with this. Just as the Trump administration can live with a post-Maduro government that is empowered by all the people within his cabinet. Not a single person that are right now in charge of Venezuela were not in charge when Maduro was also in power. Just as the Trump administration is okay dealing with them, and Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's vice president, I can easily see a very similar situation in Iran, specifically on the construct that they have been so weakened from an economic, military, and political front. And if you're analyzing it from a geopolitical area, they're extremely isolated, just like Iran. Russia vastly overestimated their ability in Ukraine and has been so wholeheartedly consumed that they have lost Syria, they have lost Venezuela, and they can lose Iran too. And there's not a goddamn thing they can do about it to stop it. And China's not going to dip their finger in it because they only care about one and one thing only in foreign policy and international relations, and that's Taiwan. They're never going to get involved in anything else. And so if the Trump administration can have a very similar agreement that they have in Venezuela, where basically Venezuela is almost like a protectorate of the United States, even though on paper the people in charge of it are anti-American, but they follow our will, why wouldn't the United States try to do that within the Islamic Republic? And that's almost a reason why they probably don't want to run the risk. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic, that the weakness of the Islamic Republic might be one of the reasons why the Trump administration and the United States decides not to push them overboard and try to deal with the consequences afterwards. Because in the end of the day, you don't know how that might look like. We have Afghanistan that borders it, Iraq, the Caucasus region. There's a lot of unknowns and a lot of instabilities that can really spread and cause much more problems than many people realize, because it's unforeseen situations and circumstances.
And I tend to agree with that. I think, one of the biggest facets that comes into play there is the concept of this nuclear custody. And that is something that I'm sure that the United States would be watching very closely in terms of how they determined to handle this situation.
No, I think this is an interesting aspect. I mean, the protests are continuing, and I think it's very important to highlight that the Trump administration is going to continue to analyze this in the protest, right? Because I think that the Iranians are analyzing this from they have 24 to 48 hours when the reporting started to come out that the Trump administration is going to make a decision to try to clamp down on the protests and try to create a situation where it's a fait accompli, where even if the Trump administration decides to do a military intervention, nothing's really going to happen because the protests have been kind of subdued and clamped down. I think that's where we're in. I think, Mike, you said that perfectly in the space. Like we're in a race for between time that who gets there first. And again, that's one of the areas to analyze. Also, another thing to highlight, very, very important, is just because the Trump administration might even authorize kinetic military operations against Iran doesn't mean it was an inherent design of regime change. It could just be a retaliation, no different than we saw during the first Trump administration bombing Syria after they utilized chemical weapons. Right, the Trump administration, and again, bombing against Syria was not designed to push Bashar al-Assad out of power. It was just to retaliate. We could see a similar scenario in Iran, which is to retaliate but not to overthrow them. And I think there's a huge broad spectrum of options that the Trump administration has to do it, and we can't just assume because they do it, it means regime change. But Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Stefano. And you bring up, the red line, you bring up Syria, right? And red lines are tricky, right? The Obama administration got itself into trouble in Syria with the red line, and now it's kind of interesting to see. Trump has kind of said a similar thing, a red line. Could he have boxed himself in a little bit here? Right, we were talking about that on the space being, a race against the clock. So Iran saying 24 to 48 hours to really subdue these protests, to kind of block any openings for the Trump administration to step in and do something, right? But it's going to be interesting to see as the administration kind of looks to see how these protests play out, to see if they can kind of gain momentum again, if there's non-kinetic options to be able to perhaps assist the protesters in a way that we won't even know about. It'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out. And when it comes to the military strikes, the kinetic side, right? It's not just random strikes, right? Random strikes on different infrastructure is not going to be what supports the protesters. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of strategy has to go into how exactly will these strikes assist the protesters in moving forward and pushing back the regime. It's a very tricky situation, right? And especially after the 12-day war, what are the targets left over? What could be hit? What could actually assist? It's just a very, very difficult situation. And I think a lot of the talk now from the Trump administration is some saber rattling, right, to see if they could shake some of the security forces loose, see how they could test that cohesion. It's also to maintain all instruments of power, right? We've seen that from the Trump administration time and time again, right? That they hold all options on the table and they're not going to let you know until it happens. So that is definitely part of the conversation right now, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next week or so.
And I think that is the key aspect, and we will definitely continue to have podcast episodes to cover this. We are also covering this extensively on our X handle and X Spaces, where we have the Intel analysts and myself included going over all the possibilities and latest news around Iran. But I think one of the summaries aspects of 2026 is it is a year that has started with a bang and with crises around the world. Some of them out of our own choice as Americans, right? The President Trump's action in Venezuela was a unilateral U.S. military operation with profound implications for the Western Hemisphere, and others out, unforeseen in the situation with Iran, the protests, and now with the violence spreading to such a point where President Trump said, "We have a red line, and I'm going to enforce it." We'll see how that looks like, and that's just something that we are definitely going to cover. But with that, I want to thank Matthew, Michael, and Mike. Thank you so much for joining me today in discussing the latest situation in Venezuela and Iran. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us soon for our next episode. We are very likely to continue to cover the situation in Iran, as that is going to be the primary story for the next couple of weeks. But with that, this has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Arcturus podcast.